Take a look at this for a moment. A woman tells the people closest to her she wants out. Not once. Not during one bad week. She says it over and over again, across years. Then one evening she leaves the gym, disappears without a trace, and 6 days later she's found dead in the woods. Now here's what should make you stop. Investigators have surveillance footage. They have witness statements. They have forensic evidence. They have an autopsy. But the one answer every family, every detective, and every person following this case is waiting for still doesn't exist. How did she die? That's not internet speculation. That's the official reality of this investigation. The cause of death remains the missing piece. Now, stay with me, because this case didn't begin in the woods, it didn't begin at the gym, and it didn't begin on the day Elena Moore disappeared. It began years earlier, hidden inside conversations that almost nobody paid attention to when they were first spoken, conversations that sound very different today. By now, you've probably heard the headlines: a missing personal trainer, a massive search, a body discovered in a wooded area, an investigation that still isn't over. But headlines only tell you what happened. They rarely tell you what it meant. And they almost never tell you what investigators still can't explain. What makes this case different isn't simply that Elena Moore disappeared. Sadly, we've seen tragic disappearances before. What makes this one different is that Elena left behind something most investigations never have. Not fingerprints, not DNA, not a confession. She left behind years of her own voice. Messages, posts, private conversations, words spoken to friends who never imagined they'd one day become part of a death investigation. Here's where the story takes another turn. Those words don't tell us how Elena died. They don't accuse anyone of a crime. They don't prove what happened after she walked away from that gym. But they do reveal a pattern that investigators, journalists, and everyone following this case can no longer ignore. And when that pattern is placed beside the official timeline, something changes. Over the next few minutes, we're not going to chase rumors. We're not going to invent villains. And we're not going to force conclusions the evidence doesn't support. Instead, we're going to do something much more important. We're going to separate fact from assumption. We'll follow the surveillance timeline. We'll examine the witness accounts. We'll break down what the forensic evidence actually says, and just as importantly, what it doesn't say. Then we'll compare all of it against Elena's own words. Because somewhere between those two stories, the woman she said she was becoming and the woman investigators were searching for, is the missing piece that has kept this case from being fully understood. Before we go any further, remember this: no one has been charged in connection with Elena Moore's death. The investigation remains active. And every conclusion we discuss today comes directly from confirmed reporting, official statements, and publicly documented evidence. Because in a case surrounded by questions, facts matter more than ever. So let's rewind the clock. Not to the night Elena disappeared, but to the first time she quietly told someone, "I want out." Because that's where this story truly begins. Now, watch this. When someone disappears, the first thing investigators usually do is work backwards. They ask the people closest to that person one simple question. Who were they in the days before they vanished? With Elena Moore, that question didn't produce one answer. It produced two. There was the Elena almost everyone knew, 39 years old, a personal trainer, someone who also worked as a pharmacy technician and bartended. 3 different jobs, 3 different groups of people, and somehow, she still had the energy to encourage everyone around her. Friends described her as upbeat, dependable, the kind of person who made other people feel better. If you only knew that version of Elena, nothing about this story made sense. But then investigators and reporters began speaking to the people who knew her beyond the gym, beyond the smiles, beyond the social media photos. And a different picture slowly emerged. Not a different woman, the same woman, just one carrying a burden very few people could see. That's where this case starts becoming much more complicated. For years, according to several of Elena's friends, she had been talking about wanting to leave her relationship. Not dramatically, Not publicly, quietly, in conversations most people would never hear. Sometimes she would say she wanted to move out. Sometimes she wasn't sure. Sometimes things seemed to improve. Then, according to those same friends, the cycle would begin all over again. Notice that word, cycle, because it appears again and again whenever the people closest to Elena describe her life. One of the earliest documented examples reaches back to 2017, nearly a decade before Elena disappeared. A Facebook Messenger conversation later shared publicly showed Elena discussing the possibility of ending her relationship and looking for somewhere else to live. Think about that for a second. This wasn't written days before she vanished. It wasn't a final goodbye. It wasn't even close. It came years earlier. That's important because it changes how we should read it. A lot of people see an old message like that and immediately try to connect it directly to what happened later. But that's not how investigations work. Context matters. Time matters. Evidence matters. An old message tells us what someone was thinking at that moment. It doesn't automatically explain what happened years afterward. That's a mistake many people make. We're not going to make it here. Instead, let's ask a better question. Why did so many different friends remember hearing almost the same thing? Not the exact words. The same concern. Several described Elena as someone who wanted to leave, then stayed. Someone who struggled with that decision, then hoped things would get better. Someone who found herself returning to the same crossroads over and over again. That doesn't prove a crime, but it does establish a pattern, and patterns matter, especially when investigators begin rebuilding someone's final months. Now here's something else worth paying attention to. Despite those conversations, life continued. Elena didn't immediately end the relationship. The years passed. Publicly, life appeared to move forward. Photos were shared. Birthdays were celebrated. Anniversaries were marked. Eventually, she got married. From the outside, it looked like everything had fallen into place. And that's exactly why this case has generated so much discussion, because social media almost always shows us the finished photograph. It rarely shows us everything happening outside the frame. Friends later described someone who had been wrestling with difficult decisions for years. The public saw a smiling couple building a future together. Both things can exist at the same time. Neither automatically cancels out the other. One of the biggest mistakes people make in cases like this is believing they can understand someone's entire life from photographs and captions. Investigators don't do that. They compare the public picture against private evidence, witness interviews, messages, timelines, behavior. Only then do they begin seeing where the pieces agree and where they don't. That's exactly what happened here. The deeper reporters dug. The more they discovered that Elena had left behind far more than photographs. She had left behind conversations, messages, thoughts shared with people she trusted. Those conversations painted a picture far more complicated than the one most people had seen online. Not proof, not accusations. Context. And context changes how evidence is understood. There's another reason this matters. When detectives investigate an unexplained death, they don't simply ask what happened that day. They ask what had been happening for weeks, months, sometimes years. Because very few investigations begin on the day a person disappears. Most begin long before anyone realizes they're part of a case. That's exactly what we're seeing here. By now, you may be wondering, if Elena had been expressing these feelings for years, why didn't anything change? The honest answer is, nobody outside that relationship can fully answer that. People stay for countless reasons: hope, love, fear, family, financial realities, or simply believing tomorrow will be better than yesterday. Those are human realities, not evidence of criminal conduct, and it's important not to confuse the two. As this investigation continued, friends began describing something else, something they say changed during the months leading up to Elena's disappearance. Not a single dramatic event, something quieter, more personal, a shift in the way she was expressing herself. This time, not in private messages, but somewhere investigators and journalists would later discover for themselves. And that's where Elena's own words begin taking on an entirely different meaning. Let's keep following the evidence, because this is where the timeline begins to shift. Not because investigators suddenly uncovered a breakthrough, but because Elena's own words started carrying a weight they never had before. Years after those early conversations about wanting out, Elena was still writing. This time, not in private messages shared with a handful of friends, but on what has been described as a second Instagram account. A quieter space, one she didn't use the same way as her public profile. According to reporting that later became public, this account wasn't filled with workout routines or everyday moments. It was where Elena appeared to express thoughts she wasn't ready to share with everyone else. And that's an important distinction. People often have different spaces for different parts of their lives. One public, one private. Neither tells the whole story on its own. As journalists began reviewing those posts, one theme appeared again and again: emotional exhaustion. Not one difficult day, not one bad week. A feeling that something inside her had been wearing her down for a long time. She wrote about pain, about resentment, about carrying emotional weight. Then, in another post, something changed. She spoke about relief, about feeling lighter, about believing a burden had finally been lifted. Those two emotions, pain and relief, sat remarkably close together. Now here's where we have to slow down, because this is where facts often get replaced by assumptions. Those posts did not identify anyone by name. They didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. They didn't explain exactly what Elena was referring to, and they certainly didn't predict what would happen later. That's why investigators and responsible journalists have been careful about how they describe them. Emotion isn't evidence. Context matters. Several people who knew Elena offered their own interpretations. One friend suggested Elena had been trying to remove toxic people from her life. Notice the word people, plural, not necessarily one individual, not necessarily one relationship. That matters because once multiple possibilities exist, the evidence no longer supports one simple conclusion. And when evidence doesn't point clearly in one direction, investigators don't guess. Neither should we. Think about how easy it is to read those posts today, knowing how this story ends, knowing Elena disappeared, knowing she was later found dead. Suddenly, every sentence feels like a warning. Every emotion feels predictive. But that's something psychologists call hindsight bias. Once we know the ending, we naturally believe the clues were obvious all along. Most of the time, they weren't. That's one of the hardest parts of investigations like this. The human mind wants everything to connect. Every message, every photograph, every conversation. We want one straight line leading directly to the answer. Real investigations almost never work that way. Instead, detectives gather hundreds of individual pieces. Some fit, some don't. Some only make sense months later. Others never become relevant at all. The challenge is knowing the difference. That's exactly where Elena's writings fit into this case. They establish something important. Her emotional state, her own perspective, her own words. What they don't establish is what happened on the night she disappeared. Those are two completely different questions, and keeping them separate is critical. Still, investigators don't ignore writings like these. Far from it. Digital evidence has become one of the most valuable tools in modern investigations. Messages, emails, social media activity, search history, calendar entries, fitness data, location records. Together, they help detectives understand what someone's life looked like before everything changed. Not because they always reveal a crime, but because they often reveal patterns, and patterns help investigators know where to look next. In Elena's case, those patterns stretched across years, not days. That tells investigators something significant. Whatever emotional struggles she was describing, they weren't sudden. They had history. History doesn't answer every question, but it gives investigators something every timeline needs: context. Now, there's another detail that deserves attention. For someone who had often shared pieces of her life online, something changed during the final weeks before she disappeared. The activity slowed, then it stopped. At first glance, that might not sound unusual. People step away from social media all the time, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for months, sometimes forever. By itself, silence proves nothing. But investigations are never built on one fact. They're built on combinations of facts. A message here, a witness there, a timeline, a camera, a phone record. One detail alone may mean very little. Several details lining up at the same time. That's when investigators start paying closer attention. Friends later described Elena's silence as unusual, not because social media defines a person's life, but because it was out of character for her. Someone who regularly stayed connected suddenly wasn't. Again, that doesn't prove a crime. It simply marks another point on the timeline, another change investigators have to account for. Then came something even more concerning. People close to Elena began noticing changes that had nothing to do with social media. Changes in conversations. Changes in behavior. Changes that would later become some of the most discussed witness accounts in the entire investigation. And one conversation in particular would leave a friend asking herself the same question she still asks today. What was Elena trying so desperately to say before she disappeared? Because in the days ahead, the evidence stops coming from messages. It starts coming from people who were there. People who looked Elena in the eyes and walked away believing something wasn't right. That's where this investigation begins, moving from years of history to the final days before everything changed. Now watch this. Everything we've covered so far happened over years. What comes next unfolds over just a few weeks. And that's when investigators stop looking only at Elena's past and begin focusing on her final days. One of the first things that stood out wasn't something Elena said. It was something she stopped doing. Friends noticed she had gone unusually quiet online. For someone who regularly shared parts of her daily life, that silence caught people's attention. Not immediately, but after she disappeared. Looking back, several people described it as completely out of character. Again, silence isn't evidence. People disappear from social media every day. But in an investigation, even ordinary changes deserve to be documented, especially when they're followed by something far more concerning. According to one of Elena's close friends, there was a conversation they never forgot. The two had met for a meal during the final weeks before Elena disappeared. From the beginning, something felt different. Not dramatic, not obvious, just different. The friend later said Elena didn't seem like herself. As their time together came to an end, Elena asked if they could speak privately, away from everyone else, away from the noise. That request alone wasn't unusual. What came next was, according to that friend's public account, Elena said she was scared for her life. 5 words. Simple, direct, impossible to forget. The friend later explained that Elena didn't fully explain what she meant. There wasn't enough time. They planned to continue the conversation later. Like so many conversations people assume they'll always have, but later never came. It's important to be precise here. That statement comes from the friend's recollection. It has been reported publicly. But investigators have not publicly released additional evidence explaining exactly what Elena meant by those words. That's an important distinction. Witness accounts are valuable. They're often essential, but they remain one part of a much larger investigation. And investigators always try to support witness memories with independent evidence whenever possible. What makes this conversation so difficult is what happened afterward. The friend later missed a phone call from Elena. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. People miss calls every day. You call back later. Life moves on. Except this time, there wasn't another chance. After Elena disappeared, that unanswered call took on an entirely different meaning. Not because anyone knows what she intended to say, but because nobody ever got to hear it. That missing conversation has become one of the quietest mysteries in this entire case. Not because it proves anything, because it doesn't, but because it reminds us how investigations are often shaped by moments that almost happened. A conversation delayed, a message never answered, a question left unfinished. Sometimes, those become the hardest pieces to live with. As investigators continued building the timeline, another series of events demanded attention. This time, not from friends, from strangers. People who had never met Elena before, people who had no reason to expect their ordinary day, would suddenly become part of a major investigation. One incident involved a food delivery. According to publicly reported accounts, a delivery driver left an order at a residence. A short time later, Elena picked up that order. The homeowner came outside. Instead of walking away, Elena appeared confused about where she was. The homeowner later described her behavior as unusual. She even started following him toward the house before the interaction ended. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't someone described by friends as reckless or confrontational. This was someone who, by multiple public accounts, seemed disoriented. That's what drew attention. Not the food itself, the behavior. Roughly an hour later, another encounter, another witness, another moment investigators had to place on the timeline. A nearby resident reportedly saw Elena looking through packages that didn't belong to her. Naturally, the resident asked what she was doing. The response has since been repeated in news reports because of how striking it was. Honestly, I have no idea. 4 words: quiet, confused, and deeply unsettling when viewed alongside everything else that happened. Let's be careful here. Confusion can happen for many reasons: stress, fatigue, a medical condition, medication, an underlying health issue, or something investigators have not yet identified. The public record doesn't provide that answer, and until the evidence does, no one should pretend otherwise. That's exactly why investigators continue examining every piece of information available. Modern death investigations don't rely on one clue. They build a complete picture. Detectives compare surveillance footage, interview witnesses multiple times, review phone records, analyze digital activity, examine medical history, study toxicology, reconstruct movements minute by minute. Because what appears confusing on its own may become perfectly clear once enough evidence is placed beside it. Or it may remain unexplained. Investigators have to be prepared for both possibilities. One of the challenges in Elena's case is that several observations from those final days seem unusual, yet none of them, standing alone, explains what happened. A missed phone call, an emotional conversation, unusual behavior, silence on social media. Each one raises questions. None answers the biggest one. That's why investigators continued moving forward instead of drawing early conclusions. Then came June 11th, the day Elena disappeared, unlike the weeks before it. This part of the investigation isn't built primarily on conversations. It's built on timestamps, security cameras, confirmed sightings, documented movements. This is where the timeline becomes far more precise, and once investigators begin reconstructing those final hours, the gaps become impossible to ignore. Because after Elena walked into the gym that evening, the evidence follows her step by step, until suddenly, it doesn't. And the silence that follows is still one of the biggest unanswered questions in this entire investigation. Now we leave behind memories, we leave behind opinions, and we move into something investigators trust more than anything else: the timeline. Because timelines don't rely on emotion, they rely on facts that can be tested: timestamps, surveillance cameras, verified sightings, phone records, physical evidence. This is where every investigation either starts coming together or starts falling apart. The evening of June 11 began like any other. At around 6:40 p.m., Elena Moore arrived at Planet Fitness in Lexington. Her entry into the gym was recorded. That part isn't in dispute. She signed in just as countless members do every day. But something immediately stood out. She didn't work out. According to investigators, Elena went inside, took a shower, and left without exercising. It wasn't what employees or investigators would normally expect from someone known for fitness. By itself, that doesn't prove anything. People change their plans every day. But once detectives started rebuilding the timeline, it became another detail they couldn't ignore. When detectives reconstruct a person's final known movements, they don't decide what matters on day one. They collect everything, even the smallest details, because something that seems ordinary in the moment can become critically important once new evidence appears. That's exactly why investigators documented Elena's visit to the gym so carefully. Not because showering was suspicious, but because it established one more confirmed point on the timeline. She was there, she was seen, and then she left. According to investigators, Elena no longer had a vehicle with her that evening. Her phone also stopped providing investigators with the kind of digital trail they normally depend on. That immediately made the search far more difficult. Today, people assume investigators can track every phone anywhere. Real life isn't that simple. Phones lose signal, batteries die, devices are switched off, or they simply stop communicating with nearby towers. Whatever happened here, the digital trail investigators hoped to follow wasn't there, and without that trail, every confirmed sighting became even more valuable. Security cameras soon provided the next piece. Investigators determined Elena was seen walking toward the wooded area behind the shopping center. At that point, the timeline was still intact. Every movement had a place. Every confirmed sighting fit together. Then, everything stopped. Not because investigators stopped looking, because the evidence stopped speaking. For approximately 2 hours and 37 minutes. There is no publicly confirmed account explaining exactly where Elena was, no verified surveillance footage, no confirmed witness placing her somewhere else, no publicly released evidence describing her movements, just a gap. And in any criminal investigation, gaps immediately become areas of intense focus. Not because detectives assume the worst, because unanswered time always demands answers. Then, at approximately 9:17 that evening, another camera captured Elena. This would become the last confirmed image of her alive. She was seen walking through a parking lot on Old Cherokee Road. She appeared to be wearing the same clothing she had been seen wearing earlier that evening. That image now marks the final verified point on the public timeline. Everything after that remains uncertain. One photograph, one timestamp, then nothing. Imagine being the detective responsible for rebuilding that night. You know where she started. You know where she was last seen. But everything between those moments, and everything afterward, has to be reconstructed from whatever evidence remains. That's one of the hardest challenges investigators face in missing person cases. You aren't trying to prove what happened. You're trying to discover what happened. Those are two very different jobs. The following morning, concern quickly turned into action. Elena's vehicle was found parked at the shopping center. Her husband reported her missing. From that moment forward, the investigation changed completely. This was no longer someone who was simply late coming home. This was now an active missing person investigation. Every passing hour mattered. Because investigators understand something the public often doesn't. The first days after a disappearance are usually the most critical. Law enforcement agencies began organizing search efforts across the surrounding area. Officers searched nearby woods. Volunteers joined the effort. Resources expanded. Every possible lead had to be examined. Every reported sighting had to be checked. Every tip had to be evaluated. Because investigators never know which small piece of information will unlock an entire case. One frustrating obstacle remained: Elena's phone. Investigators believed she had it with her when she disappeared. Yet the device wasn't helping them. No location data led search teams to her. No signal pointed investigators in the right direction. The phone itself was never immediately recovered. Without that digital evidence, search teams had to rely on something far older: people. Days passed. The search continued. The wooded areas surrounding the shopping center were examined repeatedly. Nothing. No breakthrough. No discovery. No explanation. Imagine what that feels like for investigators. You know someone is missing. You believe you're searching the right area. You commit significant resources. And still, the answers remain hidden. Then everything changed because of one phone call. Not from sophisticated technology, not from an advanced forensic laboratory, from a member of the public. Someone noticed something that didn't seem right. Investigators followed up on that information. The search shifted to another wooded area near Lakeside Middle School, roughly 1.5 miles from Elena's last confirmed public sighting. Sometimes, investigations turn because of complex science. Sometimes, they turn because someone decides to pick up the phone. On June 17th, searchers made the discovery no one wanted. A body was located in the woods. The clothing matched Elena's. 2 days later, the Lexington County coroner officially confirmed the identity. The search was over. But the investigation was only entering its most important stage. Because finding someone answers one question, it immediately creates another. How did they die? Many people assumed the autopsy would answer that almost immediately. That's how television often portrays investigations. Reality is much slower and much more complicated. A forensic examination doesn't begin with conclusions. It begins with observations. Every injury, every medical finding, every sample, every piece of evidence must be carefully documented before a pathologist reaches any opinion. Sometimes that process provides quick answers. Sometimes it doesn't. In Elena Moore's case, the examination produced something investigators never hoped for. Not certainty, more questions. And once those findings became public, this investigation changed again. Because despite everything investigators had uncovered, despite the searches, the witness statements, the surveillance footage, and the discovery in the woods, the most important answer was still missing. Now we arrive at the question everyone has been asking from the very beginning. Not where Elena Moore was found, not when she disappeared, not what she wrote, but one question: how did she die? After everything investigators had gathered, the surveillance footage, the witness interviews, the search efforts, the recovery of her body, surely the autopsy would provide the answer. Instead, it created the biggest mystery in the entire case. When the Lexington County Coroner's Office completed the initial examination, the findings surprised almost everyone following the investigation. There were no publicly reported signs of obvious traumatic injury, no gunshot wound, no stab wound, no blunt force injuries, no visible injuries that immediately explained why a healthy 39-year-old woman had died. Think about that. Investigators finally had Elena, but they still didn't have the answer. This is where television dramas often get it wrong. People imagine an autopsy always ends with a clear conclusion. Reality isn't nearly that simple. A forensic pathologist can only certify a cause of death when the medical evidence supports one. If it doesn't, the investigation continues. Not because investigators have failed, because science takes time. And science doesn't guess. That's exactly what happened here. The official cause of death was listed as pending. To many people, that sounded frustrating, even suspicious. But inside forensic medicine, the word pending has a very specific meaning. It doesn't mean investigators don't care. It doesn't mean the examination stopped. It means the evidence available at that moment wasn't enough to reach a medically supported conclusion. That's a very important difference. So what happens next? This is where modern forensic science begins working behind the scenes. Blood samples are analyzed. Toxicology testing begins. Tissue samples are examined under a microscope. Medical records are reviewed. Investigators compare laboratory findings against everything already established in the timeline. Sometimes those tests identify disease. Sometimes they identify poisoning. Sometimes they identify environmental factors. And sometimes they eliminate possibilities investigators once believed were likely. It's a process of answers, but also a process of elimination. Notice something else. Throughout this investigation, officials have been remarkably careful with their language. They haven't rushed to classify Elena's death publicly. They haven't announced a theory before the evidence supports it. They've allowed the forensic process to unfold exactly as it should. That may not satisfy public curiosity, but it's exactly how responsible investigations are conducted. One of the biggest dangers in high-profile cases is the pressure to provide immediate answers. The public wants certainty. Families deserve certainty. News cycles demand certainty. But evidence doesn't operate on deadlines. Evidence speaks only when it's ready. And investigators know that reaching the wrong conclusion too early can damage an entire case. That's why patience becomes one of the most important investigative tools. Let's step back for a moment and look at everything together. Over the course of this investigation, we learned that Elena had spoken for years about wanting out of a difficult chapter in her life. We examined messages that showed emotional exhaustion. We looked at witness accounts describing concerning conversations during her final weeks. We followed the official timeline from the gym to the last confirmed surveillance image, to the 6-day search, and finally to the discovery in the woods. Each piece answers part of the story. None answers all of it. That's what makes this investigation so different. Usually, the mystery is identifying what happened. Here, investigators know where Elena was found. They know when she disappeared. They know who reported her missing. They know many of her final movements. Yet the one answer tying every piece together remains hidden inside evidence the public has never seen. Laboratory findings, microscopic examinations, toxicology results. Those findings, not speculation, will determine where this investigation goes next. There's another point that's easy to lose in all the discussion surrounding this case. No one has been charged in connection with Elena Moore's death. Her husband, Brandon Slice, has publicly been identified by law enforcement as not being a person of interest and as cooperating with investigators. That's an important fact, because responsible reporting doesn't simply repeat rumors. It reports what investigators have officially confirmed, and at this stage, that's exactly where the evidence stands. Cases like this often become divided between two groups. One group tries to solve the mystery before investigators do. The other waits for verified evidence. History has shown us which approach usually leads to the truth. Not social media. Not online theories. Evidence. Every single time. If there's one lesson this investigation teaches us, it's this. People are often far more complicated than they appear. A smiling photograph doesn't reveal private struggles. A social media post doesn't tell the whole story. And one emotional message cannot explain an unexplained death. That's why investigators collect hundreds of pieces before drawing one conclusion. Because every case deserves facts, not assumptions. Perhaps the most haunting part of Elena Moore's story isn't what she said. It's what she never had the chance to say. There was a phone call that was never answered, a private conversation that was never finished, questions that those closest to her may carry for the rest of their lives. But those unanswered moments belong to the people who knew and loved her. The investigation belongs to the evidence, and those two things should never be confused. Eventually, the toxicology report will be completed. The forensic pathologist will issue a final determination. The official cause and manner of death will become part of the public record. When that happens, some questions may finally receive answers. Others may remain. That's often the reality of complex investigations. Closure and certainty are not always the same thing. Until then, the missing piece remains exactly where it has been from the beginning. Not hidden inside rumors, not buried beneath speculation, but waiting inside the scientific process that investigators have trusted from day one. And when that final piece is revealed, only then will Elena Moore's story be understood as completely as the evidence allows. If you want careful, evidence-first updates when this investigation reaches its next major milestone, subscribe now and turn on notifications. When the science finally speaks, we'll be here to separate verified facts from speculation and make sure you understand what the evidence really says.